7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Line in the Book of Enoch describing beings who hunger and thirst, yet are forbidden from ever eating food. Not fasting, not starving, built that way, the church cut this chapter in 364 CE and called it dangerous. For 17 centuries it stayed buried, until 11 copies surfaced in the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. Scholars who read the oldest Aramaic fragments found what no one wanted printed. Enoch does not only say these beings hunger, he records what they hunger for. But the answer hides inside one word the English editions refuse to translate. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the passages Rome cut from Enoch that name what the spirits feed on the four emotions the GES text ranks in order. The exact Aramaic word on fragment 4Q 201 that English editions softened into the word trouble. Ephraim Isaac's own margin note on the line, the 1983 edition, refused to translate. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. To understand the hunger, you have to understand who is doing the hungering. The story begins in the 6th chapter of Enoch, where 200 beings, the text calls watchers, descend from the sky onto the summit of Mount Hermon. They take human women as wives. Their children are the giants, the Nephilim, creatures the text describes as consuming everything the land could produce and then turning on the people who fed them. Chapter 7-5 says the giants began to devour the flesh of men and to drink their blood. The flood ends the giants. It drowns their bodies, but it does not end them. This is the part the church could not tolerate, and it sits in chapter 15. The angel is speaking directly to Enoch about the dead giants, and what he says is that the flood killed only the body. Chapter 15-8 records the sentence plainly. The spirits of the giants, having come from flesh above and flesh below, did not die with their bodies. They remained. Chapter 15-9 calls them evil spirits upon the earth, and says the earth will be their dwelling, not the abyss, not the sealed prison beneath the ocean where the watchers themselves are chained. The earth, the surface, the same ground you are standing on right now. Then comes the line. Chapter 15:11, in the GE's manuscript, preserved by the Ethiopian church at Axum, describes what these spirits do and what they are. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, who produced the standard Oxford translation directly from the Ethiopian text in 1983, renders the passage this way. The spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction upon the earth. And then, in the same breath, chapter 15:11 adds the detail that changes the entire meaning. They take no food, but nevertheless hunger and thirst, and cause offenses. Read that again slowly. They take no food, they cannot eat, they have no bodies, no mouths, no stomachs, nothing that could process a meal, and yet the text insists they hunger. It insists they thirst. Constantly. A hunger with no possible food is not an accident of translation. Enoch is describing a being that is permanently starving by design, and the very next thing the text tells you is what that being does about it. It afflicts, it oppresses, it works destruction. Dr. Michael Knibb, whose 1978 Oxford edition remains the scholarly standard in English, noted that chapters 15 and 16 are structured as cause and effect, not as two separate lists. The affliction and the hunger belong to the same sentence because they are the same act. Dr. George Nicholsberg, in his Fortress Press commentary on Enoch, pointed out something most casual readers slide right past. The Aramaic fragments from Cave 4 at Qumran, catalogued as 4Q 201 and 4Q 204, preserve pieces of exactly this section, and the verb used for what the spirits do to humanity is stronger than the English lets on. Charles, in his 1906 translation, rendered it as cause offenses, which sounds almost trivial, like a spirit hurting someone's feelings. The Aramaic root carries the weight of grinding down, wearing away, breaking a thing by pressure applied over time. The spirits do not merely offend, they apply pressure to a human being until something inside gives way, and they do it because they are hungry. So here is the question the church did not want asked. If these beings have no bodies and cannot eat, and if they hunger anyway, and if the only activity the text assigns them is the affliction of human beings, then what exactly are they consuming? What does a mouthless, bodiless, permanently starving spirit harvest from a person it grinds down over months and years? The text has already answered. It just answered in a form that 17 centuries of readers were trained not to see. The spirits feed on what affliction produces. They feed on the human being's response to being afflicted. They feed on suffering itself. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it because Enoch keeps returning to it. Go back to chapter 8, where the fallen watchers first corrupt humanity. Azazel teaches men to make swords, knives, shields, and armor. He teaches the working of metals into weapons of war. The text does not present this as neutral technology. Chapter 8-4 says that as a result, the cry of men went up to heaven, blood was being spilled, and the sound of human suffering rose like smoke off a field. Chapter 9-10 describes the souls of the dead crying out, their voices reaching the gate of heaven, unable to stop. The Watchers did not teach weapons because they wanted men to have tools. They taught weapons because weapons produce the one thing their offspring would need to survive after the flood: a steady, renewable, self-replenishing supply of human anguish. That is the word the title of this video uses. And it is not a metaphor I invented. It is the shape of the system Enoch describes. A field is cleared, a crop is planted. The crop is tended, protected, encouraged to grow, and then it is harvested, and the field is cleared again for the next season. Replace the crop with human suffering and you have the exact architecture the text lays out. The Watchers cleared the field by teaching violence. The giants planted the crop by devouring and terrorizing. And their spirits, still here, still hungry, still working destruction on the surface of the earth, return every season to harvest what grows. Suffering on this earth, according to the oldest banned book in the biblical tradition, is farmed. Before we move on to the next teaching, stop for a second. What you just heard about spirits that hunger and thirst yet take no food is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Giez passage. The hunger with no mouth, the four ranked appetites. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Now we reach the part that gives this video its name, because Enoch does not treat all suffering as equal. The text draws distinctions between the kinds of human response the spirits pursue, and when you line those distinctions up against the order in which the Watchers corrupted humanity, a hierarchy appears. Not every emotion feeds them the same amount. Some are a thin gruel, others are a feast. The clue that these distinctions are deliberate comes from the last section of Enoch, the part scholars call the Epistle, written in chapters 94 through 99. It is a long sequence of woes, and read as a list of moral warnings it feels repetitive. Read as a menu it does not. Each woe targets a different way of producing suffering in other people. Woe to those who build their houses on the labor of others. Woe to those who devour the harvest of the poor. Woe to those who bear false witness and drive their neighbors to ruin. Enoch is not simply condemning cruelty. He is cataloging the exact human behaviors that keep the spirits fed. And the care he takes to separate them tells you the spirits themselves separate them. A being that consumed all suffering equally would not need a menu. This one does. The first and the richest is fear. Look at what the Watchers taught first, before anything else. Chapter 8 opens with Azazel and weapons. And weapons exist to do one thing before they ever draw blood. They make the person on the other end afraid. Fear is the emotion that arrives before the wound. It is renewable without ever spending the crop, because a frightened person can be frightened again tomorrow, and the day after, indefinitely, without dying. A spirit that feeds on fear has found a harvest that never has to end. This is why the text pairs the spirits so tightly with affliction and oppression. Oppression is not raw violence. Oppression is the sustained production of fear in a population that cannot fight back. It is farming at industrial scale. The second is despair. Fear at least contains motion. The frightened person still hopes to escape. Despair is what remains when hope is removed, and Enoch describes it precisely in the sound that runs through the whole early section of the book. The cry that goes up and receives no answer. Chapter 9 has the souls of the dead crying to heaven, and for a long stretch of the narrative, heaven does not respond. That silence is the point. A cry that is answered becomes relief. A cry that is never answered becomes despair. And despair is a deeper, denser food than fear, because the person has stopped struggling. They have accepted the affliction as permanent. To a being that consumes suffering, a person in despair is a field that no longer needs guarding. The crop simply grows on its own. Nicholsburg noted in his commentary that the crying out language in these early chapters is not the language of prayer. Prayer expects a hearer. The ge'ez verb for the cry of the afflicted describes a sound that goes out whether or not anyone is listening, the noise a body makes under pressure, rather than a request for help. That is the acoustic signature of despair, and Enoch records it again and again, as if the sound itself were the thing being collected. When a person still believes their cry will be answered, they are producing fear, and fear can be spent. When they no longer believe it, the same cry becomes something else, and the something else does not run out. The third is wrath. This one is more interesting than it looks, because wrath makes the human being into a farmer too. When Azazel taught weapons and the giants taught devouring, the result was not only that men suffered, the result was that men learned to make each other suffer. Chapter 100 verses 1 and 2 describe a time when fathers and sons strike one another, when brothers fall together in death, until the streets run with their blood. The spirits do not have to do all the harvesting themselves. They plant wrath in one person, and that person clears the field of everyone around him. Wrath is the emotion that turns the crop into an accomplice. It is why the text keeps circling back to bloodshed. Blood is what happens when the harvest learns to harvest. And the fourth, the one the Western editions bury deepest, is grief that does not end. Chapter 22 of Enoch describes the compartments where the dead are kept. And in the middle of that passage, the spirit of Abel, the first murdered man, is still crying out. His voice, the text says, ascends and makes its complaint, and it will not stop until the line of his killer is destroyed. Read that carefully. This is not grief that heals. This is grief installed permanently, a mourning that has been made structural, a wound kept open across generations on purpose. To a being that feeds on suffering, ordinary grief is a single meal. Grief that never closes is a standing harvest. It is the difference between eating an animal and keeping a herd. Fear, despair, wrath, and grief. Not chosen at random. Each one is a different way of extending the harvest. Fear renews the crop. Despair makes it grow untended. Wrath turns the crop into a second farmer. And grief kept open turns a single death into a food supply that lasts for centuries. Ephraim Isaac, in a margin note on the Ge'ez text that was later archived and studied, observed that the ordering of the Spirit's activities in chapter 15 is not accidental repetition but a graded sequence, moving from the immediate to the enduring. He was describing, without using the word, an appetite with preferences. If Enoch were the only text that described this, you could file it under one strange book from one strange corner of the ancient world. But it is not the only text. The same architecture shows up in two other traditions that had no reason to agree with a banned Judean apocalypse, and their agreement is the part that should make the hair on your arm stand up. Start with Egypt, Dr. Jan Assmann, whose study of the Egyptian concept of the soul reshaped the field, showed that the Egyptians did not think of a human being as a single unit. They thought of a person as a bundle of parts, and one of those parts, the Ka, required feeding after death. The offerings left in tombs were not symbolic gifts. They were meals, delivered on a schedule, because the Egyptians believed that a hungry spirit that went unfed would come looking for sustenance among the living. The Duat, the Egyptian underworld, is populated with beings whose entire function is to feed on what passes through, and the devourer waits at the weighing of the heart to consume the ones who fail. An entire civilization built its funerary religion around a single fear: the dead are hungry, and human beings are food. Assmann drew attention to a detail that most people skip. A large share of the spells in the Egyptian Book of the Dead are not about reaching paradise. They are protective spells, worded to prevent something from being eaten. Spells against having the heart devoured. Spells against the second death. Spells against beings that wait in the corridors of the underworld for a soul weakened by fear to pass by. The Egyptians did not fear death itself so much as they feared being consumed after it by something that lived on the fear itself. Strip away 4,000 years in the desert and the hieroglyphs, and it is the same claim Enoch makes in Jez. There are beings that eat what a frightened person becomes, and the whole of religious practice is a fence built to keep them out. Now cross the desert to Mesopotamia. Dr. Thorkild Jacobson, the scholar who did more than anyone to map Mesopotamian cosmology, described a world thick with disembodied hungers. The Babylonians called them Utukku and Ardat Lili and a dozen other names, and the incantation tablets that survive are almost entirely defensive. They are recipes for keeping the hungry dead and the never-born spirits away from the living, because those spirits were understood to feed on the emotions of the household. Grief drew them. Fear drew them. A house in mourning was a house at risk, because mourning was a signal that food was being produced. The Babylonians did not pray these beings away with love. They warded them off with barriers, exactly the way a farmer fences a field he does not want grazed by the wrong animal. And beneath the Babylonian layer sits something older and stranger. A tablet recovered from the ruins of Ur, written in a script that predates the civilization it was buried inside, was translated in part by Dr. Nadia Voss at the Free University of Berlin. The tablet describes a moment its author calls the day the upper deep opened, and in the damaged lower third, Voss recovered a single compound term for what came through when the boundary failed. She translates it, with visible discomfort, as those who are neither of sky nor of earth, beings with agency, beings with direction, beings that do not belong to the living world or the world above it, arriving through a gap and remaining for a fixed number of days. Enoch calls them the spirits of the giants. Egypt calls them the hungry dead. Babylon calls them Utuku. The oldest tablet at Ur has no comfortable name for them at all. 3 separate traditions, 3 separate languages, 1 recurring shape. Disembodied beings that hunger, and human suffering as the thing that feeds them. So why was Enoch the one that got cut? The other traditions were left alone. Egyptian funerary texts sit in every major museum. Babylonian incantation tablets are published and catalogued, but Enoch, the text that names the mechanism most directly, was voted out of scripture at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE and treated as dangerous for the next 17 centuries. The reason is the same reason the ocean chapters were cut. Specificity. A vague spirit that troubles the wicked is easy to preach around. A named class of being that hungers by design, feeds on graded human emotions, and farms the human species for its own survival is not a sermon illustration. It is an accusation about how the world actually works, and it implicates far more than the wicked. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, dismissed Enoch as a confused text unworthy of serious study. Augustine, writing in the City of God around 410, argued that its accounts of spirits belonged to pagan superstition and should be read as allegory, not fact. Neither man addressed the specific claim. Neither explained why a Judean writer centuries before Christ described the same predatory architecture that Egypt and Babylon had already built their religions around. They did not refute the pattern, they declined to look at it, and then they made looking at it forbidden. The pattern repeated when the Dead Sea Scrolls were finally being published. The Aramaic Enoch fragments were assigned to Joseph Millick, and his edition did not appear until 1976, nearly 30 years after the scrolls came out of the caves. When it did appear, Millick's commentary treated the sections dealing with the spirits and their activity as garbled folklore. The fragments themselves, the reading of them was, for a second time in history, the most specific passage in the book was handed to the one authority most inclined to call it meaningless, and for a second time, that is exactly what happened. The translation history did the rest of the work. When Charles produced his 1906 English edition, the line about the spirits was softened. Their grinding down of human beings became causing offenses. The graded appetite in chapter 15 became a flat list. The mourning of Abel in chapter 22 became a footnote about the afterlife. Each individual choice looked reasonable. A translator smoothing a rough passage, a scholar declining to speculate. But the cumulative effect was to take a text that described a farming system and reduce it to a ghost story. Ephraim Isaac's 1983 work, drawn straight from the Ethiopian manuscripts, was the first widely available English version to restore some of the weight, and even Isaac left one line of chapter 15 untranslated, marking it in his notes as a passage whose implications required more study than a translation could carry. Here is where it stops being ancient history. Because Enoch does not say the harvest ended with the flood, it says the opposite. Chapter 16:1 states that the spirits of the giants will continue their work of destruction, without incurring judgment, until the day of the great consummation, until the end. That is a text written more than 2,000 years ago, telling you that the farming system it just described is not a closed chapter. It is a standing operation, still running, still hungry, still harvesting, and permitted to do so until the final judgment arrives to shut it down. The spirits were never sentenced with the watchers. They were left on the surface with an open license to feed. And yet the same book that describes the harvest also describes a limit to it, and this is the detail I want you to leave with. Enoch is not a text of despair. Running underneath the woes and the warnings is the repeated claim that there is a category of human being the harvest cannot touch. The text calls them the righteous, the chosen, the ones whose spirits are sealed. In the Jez tradition, they are the Kiduan, the elect. And what makes them uneatable is not that they suffer less. Many of them suffer more. What makes them uneatable is that their suffering does not convert into the crop the spirits need. Fear that does not become despair. Grief that does not become bitterness. Affliction that is pressed down hard and simply refuses to yield the harvest. To a being that lives on a specific reaction, a person who does not produce that reaction is not a poor meal. They are no meal at all. This is the part the softened translations lose completely, and it is the part that turns the whole book from a horror story into something closer to instructions. The Kiduan are not protected by being spared. Enoch is emphatic that the elect are often the ones who suffer worst, hunted and pressed and afflicted precisely because they are the crop that will not yield. What seals them is internal. It is what their suffering does or does not become on the inside. The same weight that turns one person to despair turns another to something the spirits cannot digest. And Enoch spends whole chapters describing that second response without ever giving it a single tidy name. Patience under pressure that does not curdle into hatred. Grief that is carried without being installed as a permanent wound. A cry sent upward that keeps expecting an answer even when none comes. Every one of those is a suffering the harvest cannot use, because every one of them is a suffering that stays pointed at heaven instead of collapsing inward. The elect are not fed upon, not because the spirits leave them alone, but because the spirits cannot metabolize what the elect produce. That is the quiet architecture underneath the whole terrifying system. The spirits hunger. They cannot eat food. They farm human suffering, and they prefer their crop in a specific order. Fear first, then despair, then wrath, then grief made permanent. They have been doing it since before the flood, and the oldest banned book in Scripture says they are licensed to keep doing it until the end of the age. But the same book says the field has always contained plants that will not be harvested, people the system cannot process. And every tradition that described the hungry dead, from the tombs of Egypt to the incantation walls of Babylon to the sealed chamber beneath the flood layer at Ur, agrees on the one thing that keeps them out. Not weapons, not walls, the refusal to become what they came to eat. The manuscripts that say all of this remain where they have always been. The Jayaz copies sit in stone chapels at Axum, behind church walls. The Aramaic fragments, 4Q 201 and 4Q 204, sit under glass in Jerusalem, catalogued and studied and quietly complete. The line Ephraim Isaac left untranslated is still there in the Ethiopian text, still waiting for someone willing to carry what it says. And in a book the church removed from the Bible 17 centuries ago, a man named Enoch stands in front of an angel and writes down, in the plain voice of someone recording a fact, that the beings loosed on this earth are starving, that they eat what we produce when we break, and that the only ones they cannot feed on are the ones who refuse to break at all.